Hey, this is Zircon, and it's finally here. Serum 2 is out. I want to tell you, it surpassed every expectation I had for an update. This is one of the best synths I have ever used and is most certainly the best update. Just to sum up what I'm going to be saying in this video, if you don't have this synth, then you need to get it even at full price. Now, what we're going to dive into is some of the features that I find most exciting, and I'm going to do some sound design with them. I'm not going to talk about literally every single change because that would take hours, but I do want to focus on the things that I think are particularly exciting. Stuff like this. But there's also some things that are only okay, and then a few items that I wish this had. I'm hoping they'll come out in later versions. Ready? Let's get started. All right, here is Serum 2. The UI has been revamped. It's absolutely beautiful. I'll admit it is a little bit intimidating if you've never used Serum before, and even if you have, there is a lot going on. It would have been nice to have a simplified, easy view, something like Pigment 6, but that's really minor stuff. The first thing I want to show is the ability to use now 2 warp modes instead of just 1. This is something that Vital and other synths were doing, and I think this was much needed, and a lot of people expected this. For example, if we pull up our Bend Plus and let's just grab any old waveform. Well, we can have our Bend Plus. So let's throw an LFO on this just to show what that sounds like. But now we can put an additional effect on this, or additional warp, I should say. And not only do we have the stuff returning from Serum 1, but we also have a whole bunch of distortion effects. Now, this actually changes the waveform itself, so this is more similar to things like wave folding. This isn't like a separate saturator that's just changing the audio signal. This is fundamentally changing the waveform itself. We could have a distortion first, so let's go ahead and put on a tube. Here's with no tube. And you can see the waveform itself is changing. So now if we do something like the PWM, it's applying the PWM to the waveform after it's gone through the tube, which is just really, really cool. Now let's say we have a keyboard type sound. Well, now we have phase distortion as an option, as well as FM, amplitude modulation, ring modulation. Phase distortion is a really cool effect that should appear in more synths. Phase distortion was popularized by the Casio CZ. So here we're going to apply phase distortion from oscillator B, which right now there's nothing there. So let's take this and we'll do a triangle. We can turn down this waveform, so we're just getting the modulation onto oscillator A. I think phase distortion kind of gives you FM-like tones, but I find that there's more of a range of good values, so it's a little bit easier to use than FM and get good sounds out of. So let's go ahead and take this. And maybe we'll raise the octave of our second oscillator. Got that FM sort of feel. And this is as good a time as any to show the new unison. One of the things I loved about Pigments is that it had more unison options than just sort of a simple number of voices in detune. And Serum 2 takes that and actually one-ups it. We have more modes than before. I particularly like, for example, in this exponential here, to change the unison range. The best way to describe this is actually to look at the waveform. So let's do 5 voices. And notice when we're changing the detune here, the other voices are evenly spaced on the side. So voices, let's say 5 and 4 on the left and 3 and 2 on the right, are evenly spaced from each other, but the middle voices are closer to the center, which just gives you a very pleasant tone. Let's try this with a supersaw type sound. Now we can make this sound different by just changing the range and the mode. So if we do this, see how this looks. In our linear mode, which is how it was in Serum 1, notice how the voices are evenly spaced. And just listen to the difference when we use one of these other ones. I find that just a little bit more pleasant. And this one, it's actually further spaced from the center. Oh, and we also have stacking now. This is like the chord feature in something like Pigments, but you can actually layer this on top of the regular unison. You don't have to pick one or the other. Now we don't need to use multiple oscillators to get a stacked octave sound. We can just apply this effect. In other synths, you would have to use 3 oscillators, or you would have to change the unison mode to just be a chord stack and nothing else. So this is just a great new feature. Wavetable stuff is cool and all. Spectral is what is really exciting in my opinion. This is not additive synthesis where you're drawing in the partials or harmonics. This is more like resynthesis, which basically takes an audio file and it breaks it down into its component partials, and then it plays those partials back as oscillators. So in a nutshell, it gives you the ability to mangle and play back audio files, but it's not actually playing the audio file, it's playing back your synthesized version of it. And because it's synthesized, you have way more control over the parameters of the synthesis. So we can apply warp effects, we can change the playback speed and the pitch in all sorts of interesting ways. Here's a straightforward choir sound. Nothing special. Now if we play it down an octave, that pretty much sounds like what you would think it would sound like if we were just playing back in a sampler. But we can also change the playback speed, otherwise known as scan. And this gives you a sort of time stretch effect. Where it gets fun though is when we get into the warps. So now let's do something like add subharmonics using our first warp effect. And you can see this is not just processing the signal with an effect in the sense of EQ or chorus, it's actually changing the synthesized waveform. And why don't we change it from one shot to forward and reverse so we get an infinite sustain. But there's a lot of other very interesting spectral effects here. This might be my favorite part of Serum 2 so far. Like, what is happening? This is wild. It almost sounds like there's reverb here with this frequency smearing effect, but there's no effects here. It's just the warp. For drones and ambient style sound design, this is just a playground. Now let's try the spread. What? Now we're collapsing the frequencies. We're way into atonal territory now. Spectral gates. Oh, and why not make this unison? Just like anything else in Serum, we can modulate it. Let's make a nice slow envelope on that. So that's pretty amazing stuff. Aside from the warps, the spectral filter is pretty fantastic as well. You may have seen things like Filter Table come out recently from Kilohertz, and that is pretty much just a filter that has a lot of different cutoff points, and then being able to move those cutoff points all at once using the filter cutoff knob. Well, the Spectral synth here has the same capability using the spectral filter. So I'm going to go ahead and load up a preset, something like metallic. And then we can sweep that. Let's throw a LFO on it. But this is really more powerful than using a separate filter or wavetable filter, filter table, whatever you want to call it, because once again, this is actually changing the waveform itself. And so that modulated waveform can then go through wavefolding distortion or FM or phase distortion or anything like that. We could do a different filter shape. So the Spectral oscillator is fantastic. This is a treasure trove of sound design, and it's going to be so much fun. And of course, you can load your own samples or even PNG images. I'm going to load this picture of a pug. Which I guess sounds like this, but I don't know, let's shift it around. How about some subharmonics in here? And why don't we make this into like a bass sound, right? We can change the playback point. And how about we throw on a filter, because why not? We can do that. Oh man, this is good. May I remind you, this came from a picture of a pug. Anyway, next up we have the granular oscillator, which still has the pug in it. So let's go ahead and load a different sound. With granular stuff, using like a bowed sound is a good place to start. Here is a bowed erhu, which is a Chinese cello violin-esque instrument. And we have our loop point from before. Now, as far as granular synthesis goes, this is pretty standard, or at least so I thought. When you look at the parameters here, you've got your grain density, and you've got length, which can make things sound a little more spiky or more legato. You've got randomness, of course. How about random length and panning? So that's pretty great, I would say, as far as playback, but it's nothing we haven't heard before. However, what I found was that if you dig in a little bit deeper, you have control over the shape of the grains in a way that I don't think a lot of other granular synths offer. And this is pretty cool. This kind of shape is like a slightly exponential fade in and out. It's closer to linear, but we can also change the window amount. If we have no window, then the grains just play back in full. But we actually like having a little bit of a fade in and out. We can skew it one way or the other. So here we're giving it like a sharper attack. But we have a whole bunch of different shape options. There are different kinds of curves. You have stuff like this, which is very, very spiky. Very, very cool for sound design. of course, you can apply warps to the granular synthesis as well. How about some phase distortion? We can do this via a nice slow-moving LFO. And we can hear what that sounds like with all kinds of different wavetables in Oscillator B. So if this isn't getting you excited as a sound designer, I don't know what will. This is pretty amazing stuff. Now, when it comes to sample playback, this sample oscillator, I don't quite get why it's here. I mean, I kind of get it because you want to be able to just play back a sample without granular synthesis or without the spectral synthesis feature. So if that's our erhu, which I guess sounds more like a synth, I think it's a synthesized erhu, then okay, being able to play it back and being able to do unison detuning and stuff like that, I guess that's fine. And this is comparable to what we have in Pigments for sample playback. But then there's also multi-sample playback, and this is absolutely not what I expected. You can load up entire SFZ files, that's Sforzando, which is an open source sample mapping format, which now puts Serum 2 more in the class of like Falcon or Alchemy. I don't know what to say. This is just... I would not have expected Serum 2 to have this level of sample playback. This is more powerful than the Pigments one, which I think can do up to 6 samples at a time. The Sforzando files here can be quite in depth. So if we go to something like the Baby Grand Piano, I think that, what is that, like 60, 70 samples? If you had told me that this was coming from Serum, you told me that a couple years ago, I would have looked at you like you had 3 heads. This is very unexpected capability. It's very cool because you can apply warps and unison and all that other stuff that we've talked about. It's amazing. There's really no other way to put it. This kind of capability blows everything wide open. And a neat feature that it has is the ability to change timbre. What this knob does is it effectively changes the format of the sound by changing the root note of the sample playback, but then repitching it afterwards. It's kind of like applying 2 different stretches to the sound. For example, if we take something on C3, and then in my DAW, I drop this an octave, and then I bend this down a full octave. Now we're hearing the same sounds with standard pitch time shifting applied to them, but we're also getting them an octave lower than we want, which is not ideal. So this knob corrects for that. If we turn the timbre down 12 semitones here, then we get that format shifting effect, but it also puts it in the correct playable range. In something like Contact or other samplers, you could achieve the same effect by editing the root notes of the sample and then applying some pitch shifting afterwards, but this is just way more convenient. Doing a little phase distortion from Oscillator B again, or we could do some regular distortion. Let's turn the unison down and we'll pick a different multi-sample this time. So it's great to be able to get some saturation in your samples in this stage without using any effect slots, which we're going to get to. And why not apply FM to this? I mean, it just feels like we could load single samples from here, having a separate sample type. I don't know. It just seems a little extraneous, but very minor complaint. Now, when it comes to the filters, there are a bunch of new types, but there are 2 that are particularly exciting. One is the acid filter. Let's see what that sounds like. I'm going to apply velocity to cutoff. Well, that just sounds like a regular filter, right? Let's check the resonance. Ooh, that is acid. But we also need an envelope. You can't have acid without some kind of filter envelope on the sound. When you have a filter like this pushed the resonance really high, I think that shows you the quality of the emulation. So if we just switch to like a Serum 1 filter, I mean, that's fine. It sounds pretty good. Or like the Wasp filter, which is new. Just doesn't sound the same. It's that squelchiness that is just perfect. I love this. It's as good as the 303 filters I've ever heard. If you're doing acid, you gotta have some glide. That is a lot of fun. This goes great with the new clip sequencer. I mean, I'm calling it a sequencer. It's pretty much a miniature DAW inside of Serum 2. Like I'm just gonna hit record and play a pattern. Control Q to quantize. And note we can change the playback here to all kinds of different modes. We could play this in reverse, or at random, or all these other modes. But let's go ahead and just do normal. And then I'm going to change the rate to 2x. And let's go ahead, select all, transpose down. Again, this is like a full piano roll. And notice that we have velocity, which can be applied any way you'd like. In my case, I already have velocity affecting the filter cutoff. But let's say you wanted to do another kind of modulation here. Well, we can add a new automation lane. And let's say it can be applied to so many different things. It's just wild. But I'm going to go ahead and assign this to macro 1. And we're going to say that macro 1 is resonance amount. We can click to add points here. I have no idea if this is going to sound good or not, but the point is just to show how this feature works. And I will say the editing here is a little bit clunky. I don't know. There's something about it just doesn't feel as smooth as I would like. But I mean, again, very minor complaint for this absolutely insane new feature. So anyway, we have this playback, but that macro is not assigned to anything. So now we would just apply that macro as we would anything else in Serum. So let's do that for macro 1. And now we should hear in the clip that driving the resonance amount as well. Awesome stuff. Really, really cool. But there's another filter that I think is really good, and that is the PZSVF. And this is sort of similar to that Spectral filter that I showed earlier. This lets you draw your own filter curve. This is showing what is going on in the waveform spectrum. What I just drew here is like almost like a format filter. We can make this into, I don't know, some kind of Reese or something. Ooh, that's kind of a bug, actually. The LFO envelope interaction is not quite correct. So, okay, very minor problem. And naturally, there's lots of preset shapes here. So that's going to be a whole lot of fun for all kinds of sound design, but especially bass sound design, in my opinion. All right, there's so much other stuff to talk about, but I don't want this video to be hours and hours long, so I want to visit the effects page next. Let's do a little super saw type sound. I'm going to throw on one of the other new filters. So now in the effects section, the lid has been blown wide open here, and it's a lot closer to something like Phase Plant, although there's not quite that many modules. But now you can instantiate however many modules you want, and you can do duplicates of the same one. So Serum 1 had kind of a fixed rack. You could move them around, but you couldn't have, for example, 3 distortions in a row. Well, now you can. Let's go ahead and throw on a hyperdimension here. And now we have 2 buses to play with, so let's do a delay here. We're not going to hear anything yet, though, because we need to route it. So I'm going to go to the Mix tab, which is completely new, and we'll put some of our oscillator A signal into bus 1. We'll turn that all the way up because we're basically using this as a send. But wait a second, we're not hearing the filter in that bus. So what we need to do is we need to send the filter into bus 1. And let's mix that down. And this is just great to be able to balance between everything here. It's just a more streamlined view, which I really appreciate. And why not use some noise, including the new noise colors here, which I think is a very handy new feature instead of just using noise samples. The creative possibilities here are absolutely wild because now that you have all kinds of different routing and send capabilities, you can imagine the chains can get out of control. And there's a whole bunch of chain presets as well as per module presets too. Let's look at a couple of these new effects too. There's a frequency shifter, which is very, very interesting. It's hard to describe in a nutshell everything it's doing, but it is acting like a standard frequency shifter in some ways, but then also it's doing some panning stuff and it's got a delay on it. I need to spend more time with it, but it's very, very interesting. Here's without. There's also a really wild new set of reverbs. So as a refresher, here's our original plate reverb from Serum, which I thought was, good, but nothing to write home about. So that's fine. And then here was the hall. But now we have a very nice sounding vintage plate. Very smooth sound here. That's just so you can hear it. I think that sounds quite nice. But what is this? Nitrous? What is happening? It's kind of like a shimmer reverb. It's certainly long tail. Kind of reminds me of Valhalla Supermassive a little bit, but very unique algorithm, and it's got actually several sub modes that you can use. This is just 100% mixed so you can hear it. Let's hear this with another instrument as well, maybe one of our lovely acoustic ones from the multi-sample category. Definitely not what I was expecting from Serum. And then there's this bass and reverb, which again, I don't fully understand what it's doing, but it sounds pretty interesting. Start with 0% wet. I think it's kind of like a spring reverb. Very cool stuff. There's also some handy new utility modules. I like this one, just lets you invert polarity, do width, simple low pass and high pass. Okay, so with one of these new presets, just to show how the utility works, we can now make our bass mono if we wanted to. Just a little bit cleaner for mixing, change the stereo width really easily. or add a quick and dirty high pass or low pass. So that stuff is all really useful. But speaking of presets, the last thing I want to touch on is the new preset browser, which is vastly expanded. This is way better to navigate. There's over 1,000 out of the box. A lot of really, really good stuff. Well, that's nice. What I like is that there's a lot of these bread and butter sounds, not just the super design stuff. Now we're in like Korg Triton territory. But there's another nice new feature here, which is the ability to hybridize presets. Now, as a warning, this gets pretty wild. Let's take, for example, this sound. And there's this one, which is completely different. So what happens when we hybridize them? I guess that. Or how about this harpsichord and dream keys? Let's hybridize those. I will say you get very unexpected results using hybridize. This changed the tuning for some reason. I don't quite understand how that happened. That's a good sound, I like it. Doesn't really sound like a blend of those to me, so I don't really know how that works. And one other minor complaint I have about this feature, first of all, I think it's incredibly useful for inspiration and certainly just getting a huge variety of sounds from the already massive library of presets. But something I noticed was that when you do the hybridize, sometimes it gives you macros that don't work, and some don't. Like this one works. This one doesn't seem to do anything. This one does do something. But also, I don't think noise is a good description. So anyway, it's a very minor complaint. I think this is something that I could see being finessed over time. And anytime you're using that, I think you're pretty much going to have to expect wild results. And if I had one other thing that I wish could be implemented in a future version of Serum 2, I would love to have a traditional shimmer reverb in the way that Pigments has it, for example, where you have control over the pitch. And then I'd love to have some kind of pitch delay. I just love pitch delays. FM8 has had one for like 15 years now, and then Pigments has one, which is really nice. And I just think it's a really nice sounding effect that I wish more synths would have. And with the amount of creative effects that are already here in Serum 2, it would just be the cherry on top of the sundae. But yeah, that is my quick overview and some of the things I like the most about Serum 2. Without a doubt, this is an S-tier synthesizer. I highly recommend you get it regardless of what genre you're doing. I would have said for the first Serum, like it's very much an EDM focused synth, might have trouble with some of the more analog emulations, certainly could not do anything even remotely approaching the kind of features we now have with the granular oscillator, the multisample, the spectral synthesis. So now the sound design capabilities are so wide open that I could imagine this being used for soft new age and ambient music, cinematic soundtracks and action cues, and really all that stuff. So if you have Serum 2, I'd love to hear what you think, what your favorite features are, and maybe what you'd like to see in future versions of Serum 2. Anyway, this has been Zircon. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.